Nothing Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard. With me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. I think, therefore I am. Even the uninitiated have heard this philosophical quote, but what many don't realize is what led up to this moment, or what transpired afterwards. Indeed, many may not even realize that this quote, and the apparently unshakable knowledge it holds, is actually dated and very much up for debate. But how can this be? You're listening to this podcast, thinking, being. Surely that means you exist, right? Some would say yes, and some would say no. Today we're looking at different flavors of skepticism. All right, so we changed our intro a little bit. I'm no longer a graduate student in education. I've gotten my master's degree. I may move on to other things in the future, but for now, I'm just a regular Joe.
No, you're never a regular Joe, man. You've just ascended that next pinnacle, and now you're taking in the view.
Right. Before going on to the next one.
Yes.
So skepticism, let's jump right into it. Can you explain for us the difference between ordinary skepticism and philosophical skepticism?
There's a relationship. The skepticism, philosophically, at its start, was essentially questioning the reliability of knowledge claims. Where it gets philosophically extreme is way back pre-Socratic times. It's questioning the possibility of knowing anything at all, and therefore even questioning whether one exists. And the various flavors of that move all the way up through to, as you say, Descartes, with different results. So in the earliest, we have Heraclitus talking about you can't put your foot in the same river twice. And then a little bit later, Cratylus, Plato did a dialogue with Cratylus, who was a philosopher, who suggested you can't even put your foot in the same river once because everything is always changing. Even then, realizing that the human form is changing, one's mind's changing, the water is changing. And that's where the extremist part began. Okay.
So let's break down what it takes to have skepticism, or to have, I guess, what the antithesis of skepticism would be, which would be knowledge, you think?
Well, the antithesis of skepticism, I don't think I would say knowledge. It's more likely faith.
Okay. So that's an interesting thing. When we're looking at skepticism, in doing research, they said that the first thing that you can't have to have skepticism is belief. You can't believe in something and also be skeptical. Do you think that's true? Is there any way around that?
St. Augustine said that there was a way around it, saying that you essentially, just terribly paraphrasing, but boiling it down, not even paraphrasing, summarizing, faith is the only answer when all of your knowledge claims disintegrate. So yeah, I don't think so. I think if now the extreme skeptic, verging toward the nihilist, perhaps, might say, nope, nothing can exist because we can't prove that anything exists. But many, including, and even Descartes, who was wrestling, trying to figure out, how do I justify the existence of God, in which I believe in, and at the same time not knowing anything, and then realizing that cogito ergo sum essentially means God created me, and therefore I can trust that I exist. So it's sort of a cheat. So no, I don't think that. I think that faith is, or things such as faith, are the opposite.
Yeah, so I'm still thinking about that belief and skepticism, right? So if you believe in something, can you be skeptical?
You can put yourself into a skeptical position. And I wouldn't say that belief and believing in something is necessarily the same thing as faith.
Right.
One suggests an active attempt towards something. I believe. I Mulder. I want to believe. Right? And so there's that. But I think that if you are a person of faith, let's say, then you allow yourself, I would say sometimes unduly or without justification, to be skeptical about other things, such as science.
Maybe what will help clear it up is if we establish if there's a difference between being skeptical and questioning. Is there like an attitudinal difference between these two, or are they essentially the same thing? Because I think that would kind of determine whether or not you can both believe and be skeptical.
Skepticism implies a theory or an organized discipline and attitudinal consistency in your approach to knowledge. Questioning, which is what you're going to laugh with, but this is it's actually Socrates. That's how we're supposed to pronounce it. That's it. We all say Socrates because we just give up the academic knowledge, right? But the Socratic method is to question, but not assuming that there's not the possibility of gaining knowledge. Extreme skepticism seems to suggest that we should give up on this idea of being able to have knowledge. Skepticism, not of the extreme kind, is a disciplined approach to questioning what seems to be there. And then we have, and we're jumping all over the time scale, but then we have Hegel and Heidegger, who both, in their various ways, were saying pretty much what you need to do is to have a provisional kind of approach, which is to say, well, this is what we seem to know, but it is likely to change, and we head more to the inductive. In other words, the various ways of saying this, both Hegel and Heidegger, was that you can have preconceptions about things, but preconceptions that take us into the negative and take us into the destructive are to be abandoned. Preconceptions that are we operate from some preconceptions always, they would say, because we can't have all knowledge and we don't have all the experience in the world. So we operate under things that we have been told. We test them, they seem to make sense, and if those things then lead us on to better things, then they are of worth. So they would say we have preconceptions. Those preconceptions may have some questionable basis, but where do those preconceptions take us as we continue to question? That's the intentional, what's the intent, that kind of question.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, just before we move on, so it'd probably be accurate to say if you have a belief, let's say I believe that the earth is round, right? I cannot be skeptical about that belief, but I can question that belief. I can hold that I believe that the earth is round and question it, but I can't hold I can't hold the belief that the earth is round and be skeptical about it at the same time. Right?
Yes, I would say that.
Okay.
And then to follow what we said before, using your example, the belief was that the earth was round, but then the questioning of it leads to, well, it's not quite. It's
an oblate spheroid.
Yeah, exactly. See?
Right. Yeah. So, and that's an important distinction, especially when we start, putting a critical eye towards the current times we live in, right?
Yes.
Because when you look at specific scenarios and you start to see people distrusting science, for instance, right?
Yeah.
You have people that say, okay, well, let's take QAnon, right? So if you have people that are saying, well, the government's actually controlled by this, and Trump's going to be put back in office on January 4th, January 18th, February 4th, March 3rd, March 18th, and it never happens, right?
Yeah.
Then that seems pretty ridiculous, right? But then if you think about it, from a sort of objective term, and you look at scientists who say, well, the Earth is 12 billion years old, 14 billion years old, 13 billion years old. Mm-hmm. Some people might say, well, what's the difference? But the difference is being questioning versus skepticism, right? There's sort of,
yes,
you have, like you said, you have preconceived notions, you have a structured way of approaching something, and then really you're asking questions to define parameters of what is known versus trying to just sort of reinvent the wheel or spout off on something.
This is foundational. It's so important, because what you just described with the age of the Earth is a constant questioning, using measurements, taking new findings to bolster and poke at the theory. And the theory holds. We're ancient. We're really ancient. So 1 billion years difference in the scheme of 14 or 15 billion years isn't all so much. So for those who claim that Trump would come back in March 4th, March 20th, on and on, what's your evidence? The only evidence is the word of mouth, supposedly, of somebody who calls himself Q for QAnon, and those words are somehow supposed to be taken as a cult-like, absolutely verifiable, except they're not verifiable. Somebody said them, but so what? Where's the evidence? Where do you and so that's where it falls apart.
Right. So, I think that's why people get frustrated with science, and why some people would see it as being, a sham. But in reality, you have to accept what you said at the beginning, is that these knowing things, having knowledge, is a very elusive thing, and it's really something that is a constant process of being built rather than a static concrete commodity. And so when the CDC, right, stay 6 feet apart, stay 3 feet apart, mask, double mask, it goes back and forth. People say, oh, well, this just proves that they don't know what they're talking about and the whole thing's a sham, right? But
nonsense.
No, really, there's new evidence coming to light about how the virus lives on surfaces, how it attaches to cells, how it does these different things.
And we're talking about 3 feet for a certain age group under certain conditions that are controlled conditions.
And these are things that we'll talk about as we get further, right? Because there's people talk about skepticism and contextual factors. But I think what we're leading into right now is the second sort of condition of skepticism. We talked about belief and the role that plays. The next part is justification, right? Yeah. So justification of knowledge, what kind of role does that play in that sort of structured theory of skepticism?
It plays a very important role in any number of venues. So let's take something like justice. Let's assume that we think we know what justice means, and most everyone has a slightly canted version of what that might mean. For some, it's vengeance. For some, it's, along the whole spectrum. So, but in our justice system in this country, you are innocent until proven guilty, it is said. And a body of evidence has to be built up to convince a juror or jury that there is guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. There's your skepticism. Reasonable doubt is if anyone has ever read 12 Angry Men or seen versions of this, it's a marvelous discursive example of skepticism at work. And what we see is that people often thinking is very hard. it requires work. and so people who just want to get out of the jury room, or people who are angry because they got put there in the first place, are unlikely to want to spend time thinking about a case. They're often already decided what the case will be before they walk into the room. Sometimes they tell the people who are selecting the jurors, maybe they have a reason, and say, oh, no, I'm open-minded. And that's why questions happen about the choices of jurors. So that's just one example. So you to try to justify one's belief requires, in some systems, presenting evidence, examining the evidence, and examining in the context of previous evidence, and examining the possible intentions of the presentation of the evidence. It's all those things we learn about, or should be teaching about, and some of us do, about searching the internet. An academic journal is much more knowledgeable than somebody putting something up on Facebook just because they want to see something. And if you can't determine the difference between those two things because you just want to believe that thing that you see on Facebook, you're not going to arrive at good knowledge or justifiable knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And I mean, we're surrounded by it in society. And that's why, talking about authority like we did last week, you realize that culture imposes a large part of authority. Culture is, in a sense, subjectivity. It's an inherent subjectivity that you have a very hard time shedding. If you are been immersed in this culture your entire life, then you miss things. And we see it all over the place. A good example for this would be, I wanted to put on some muscle over quarantine, right? And so you see they have the, magazines and websites everywhere for these things. And, they're trying to do stuff. Well, I've never gone that route, right? So I'm looking at articles that end in, websites that end in edu, right? Mm-hmm. Or gov.
Yeah.
And looking at studies. And some of them are very boring. And most of them are based around elderly people or people with muscle, atrophy. And, and you think to yourself, well, is this something that's really going to apply to, a healthy 30-something-year-old guy? So, but it's scientifically researched. And a lot of what they say kind of flies in the face of some of those other things, Mm-hmm. And I was able to put on, 6 pounds. And it worked out pretty well. And then I read an interview with a guy who used to write articles for some of these magazines. And he said, no, he's like, we write stuff that is bad advice in order to sell you supplements that don't work, in order to get you to keep coming back to try to get more advice. Right? Yeah. So yeah, it's how you're determining what knowledge is a complicated thing. And the role that culture plays is hugely important. I was reading just recently an anecdote from a guy who runs a company with another woman, and she went on vacation, and he'd always thought that he was much better at his job than she was, because he got through more accounts, he had more positive responses, that sort of thing. So the woman goes on vacation, and he's dealing with this customer that he's dealt with many times before. And all of a sudden, it's not working. The customer is questioning everything that he's saying and doing all this, arguing and talking about not renewing their business and stuff. And all of a sudden, the guy realizes that he had been emailing the customer from the woman's account while she had been out. So when she came back, they did an experiment where they switched accounts, and they ran that way for a week. And what they found is that she had the exact same results that he had, and he had the exact same results that she had. When people were dealing with people who they thought were of the opposite gender, they reacted a different way. Mm-hmm. And there's been many studies with resumes, right? You put on an ethnic name on a resume, the exact same resume as a resume with a white name. People will see it differently. Right. They always, that's the influence of culture justifying knowledge. And it's interesting because the evidence for the knowledge can be the same in all of these scenarios, but the justification is different based on preconceptions, not anything that has any sort of systematic or structural integrity of
Yes,
any kind.
it's the preconceptions that can get in the way.
So that's an extremely long sort of thing, but it's just to demonstrate the importance of examining these sort of core beliefs and core conceptions that we have about how we form or how we determine what we know. So speaking in that vein, let's head on a little bit and talk about what separates Cartesian skepticism from Pyrrhonian skepticism. Did I say that right?
You did.
Okay.
One of the differences, at least in my thinking and reading, is that Cartesian skepticism is focused more on the idea of identity, whereas Pyrrhonian and pre-Socratic work was focused more on knowledge itself, what can be reliably determined. So for me, that's where it becomes more interesting. The mind-body problem, the dualistic thing of Cartesian work. Ultimately, it's about, do I exist or don't I? And cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, is the basis then of going on to the other justifications, as it were. So that's, I think so. I think that's it.
Okay. So that Pyrrhonian skepticism, that sort of leads down the road of what we have been sort of referring to throughout the episode, which is this idea that almost it's the question: is there such a thing as knowledge? Can you know anything?
Yeah, that's the basis of it.
So, what did human Kant add to the discussion here?
To be simplistic, I think they've opened up new degrees of application and possibility. And that sounds too generalist, but I think that you start with Hume and Kant thinking about knowledge in a more human, universal sense. And you start getting into the application of skepticism to the idea of ethics. And the fusion of that it takes it far away from the pre-Socratic work.
So with Hume, the thing that stuck out to me about that, before we started recording, we were kind of talking about something similar. All right. So we were talking about past episodes where my one cat showed up on the recording with her jingly bell and her meowing.
Yep.
And how if you're listening to the podcast just on your own, all of a sudden you hear that, and I start wondering in my present timeline, oh, where's the cat? Right? Where's the cat? Where's the cat? But the cat's on the podcast recording. So yep. Hume was sort of the persuasion that we would be Pyrrhonian skeptics if our own human nature didn't stand in the way of making it so. In other words, our sort of metacognition, our ability to think about our own thinking, tells us that it kind of tells us we're special, right? Or we're different, that we exist in some way that can't be questioned, right? And Kant sort of went against that, right? He sort of thought, well, the very notion that we have sort of ideas of morality makes that argument not nonsensical, but
problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah, because in Kantian terms, we've talked about Kant before. It's not like, I don't heroify some of these folks. They were human beings, but they were fascinating. They had messy lives, and this is often the criticism of philosophers. David Hume might have been brilliant, but he also didn't treat his family well, and so on. I've heard this from various people. Oh, okay, so we can accept the the messiness of certain people who are in great authority and then not accept others. That's a strange thing in itself. But Kant was looking for the larger applicability of morality. It's not as simple as that kind of approach. So that maybe honoring your parent is cross all cultures, but on the surface of it, it might not seem that way. And so you have to look at experience and determine whether that experience may actually point to an ethical position that you wouldn't have noted if you hadn't thought about it really hard. Another way of going about this is to think about it in Hume's case, but really in most philosophy. If we look at if we look at the recognizable practice of anchoring much of our worldview in mythology and metaphor, we are metaphorical creatures. We couldn't communicate without metaphor, really. Then we are never going to be as accurate as we might potentially like, because metaphor and mythology, not myth as in falsehood, not the current tripe, but the idea of stories. Those tell us many things about ourselves, but they are not always precise and acutely accurate.
Yeah, and so I don't have much evidence to back this up, right? But I would assume that you have Hume, you have Kant, and think about the existential philosophers, right? You have Kierkegaard. Who was the other famous
Camus,
absurdist?
Sartre. Oh, well, absurd. I mean, Ibsen was his plays and so on, but if we look at existentialism, you have Kierkegaard, and then you have the absurdists, and they're part of existential philosophy, but they're almost opposing in their viewpoints, right? Because Kierkegaard subscribes to a Christian viewpoint. The absurdists say there is no meaning. That's the only way to explain everything, is that none of it has any meaning. So probably Kierkegaard and Kant might line up a little bit, and the absurdist might line up with Hume a little bit. So there's almost a division appearing here, right, in how we apply skepticism. And those two viewpoints tend to be, way overly simplify it, when it comes to being skeptical, you're either saying it's impossible to know anything, or God is responsible for it, or or it's possible to know some things, but provisionally. Right. So there's that in between space. So it's how you apply it is different, but the idea of the value of it seems to be consistent. Right. So where do you fall on this timeline? Who do you? I'll answer that if you will. Okay. So right now, at this time in my life, I think that I'm probably, you get older, you study, you've had an entire academic career, practice, an academic practice. And practice means constantly learning new things. My wife and I were having this marvelous discussion last night. We both are reading. We're both ink drinkers. So there's a term in Venezuelan culture. I don't remember where it comes from, but there are different words for bookworms. Well, I like ink drinker. Yeah, that's cool. Ink drinker is cool. Anyway, and she's reading this terrific book on Greek culture. Now, it's partly poetry, partly historical fragments, partly creative fiction based on the presentation of a fragment. And that just stirs up the pot, so to speak. It's just such a stew, such a wonderful stew. And I was reading a poem in the current issue of Philosophy Now that is about the Greeks and what they offered us and what they messed up. And so we were reading these things back and forth, and then we got onto something else. I said, I've been reading this marvelously interesting book on Black history called 400 Souls. And there are 80 different essayists of renown talking? But up until that moment of reading that first essay, I did not know that on August 20th, 1620, a ship called the White Lion brought to the Virginia colony the first recognized shipment of people who had been enslaved. And the essay was about, in the very next year, at about the same date, the Mayflower arrives. So we have two ship stories within the space of 365 days, and we created the entire culture based on the mythology of the Mayflower, the deification of the Pilgrims. When all this other stuff had been, the horror and the pain and the suffering that generated this country would not have been generated without this. We ignore the story. And thus we ignore knowledge. And we do not come to terms with knowledge. And so for me, to answer your question a long way around, is that I am ever skeptical of triumphalism, exceptionalism, and the notion that, by golly, we're just better than everybody else because why? Because we live within a certain set of borders and we're white? No, I don't think so. And to continue to learn just points out, as Socrates said, I know nothing, right? But I keep learning more. And so for me, skepticism isn't about constantly looking negatively at things. I think skepticism is an extremely positive thing, because if you can say, I didn't know that, and you can look at where the sources were and look at the bibliography and say, okay, I accept the justification of this from an academic viewpoint. It resonates in a human way, and I need to rethink even more.
Right. Yeah, that was great. That was a great explanation. I think you said something in there that really struck with me, which was, I know nothing, yet I'm always learning more.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting, right? But I think that kind of encapsulates sort of my viewpoint on it too, right? Which is that, when trying to, it seems like to say that we can never know anything seems overly critical, right? Overly negative. There's something about it that doesn't quite ring true. But also to try to come up with these sort of stock, unquestionable paradigms from which to establish knowledge seems equally as a cop-out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you, I kind of look at nature, right? So to me, as long as there's mystery, as long as there's a mystery of some kind, I think that there's going to be continual questioning, right? But that doesn't change the fact that some things are sort of knowable. So, you look at space, right? And it's like, okay, well, we don't know if it ends or if it doesn't end or if it wraps back around on itself or what's going on. Or, Heraclitus with the stream, right? Well, you can step in the same stream twice, but at the same time, you also can't, right? There's all these different questions, all these different things. And to me, it seems like, okay, you can. I think that you can know something, but like we were talking about before with science, it is this ever evolving thing. It's not a negative thing.
It's inductive. It's
right.
Yeah.
There's things that you have. There's a form, right? And you're constantly questioning and refining them, and they're just sort of shape shifting a little bit, right? But they're there. I think there's something there, and so you might float down the stream, and maybe it's the same stream, or maybe all the water's different, so it's not the same stream. But there's rocks in that stream, right? That are always there. Mm-hmm. And the rocks might be getting eroded, so maybe they're not the same rocks, but there's something there, right? And so it's just sort of extrapolating out that idea, something as simple as a stream. can raise these questions of, well, is it the same stream? Is it a different stream? But the fact of the matter is the stream is there, but it's changing, and its existence is change. So trying to establish static, concrete knowledge may be impossible, but that doesn't mean that knowledge itself doesn't exist. It's just something that's evolving. Right?
Well said. Well said. I'm going back to Cratylus, who said we can't even step in the same stream once because the stream is changing even as our toe hits it, then when the foot goes in and so on. But he also took the interestingly extreme position that communication, because human beings change, because words are uttered before they're even heard by the other person being talked to, the thought is changed in the mind of the person who's talking, and therefore communication can't really happen. So the story is that whenever anybody talked to him, at one point he just stopped talking altogether and he just wiggled his little finger to say, "I've heard you." Because he didn't believe communication was possible. I don't find that a particularly useful.
Right.
It certainly was a prefacing of all of the ideas of language and communication, some of which we've talked about across these podcasts in the late 20th century and early and 21st century, about the difficulties of words and understanding their meaning and having multiple definitions which slide around. But if we stop attempting communication, then our skepticism has led us into an utter dead end where we might feel completely justified in our own beliefs always, constantly, and we'll surround ourselves with other people who do, but we won't get anywhere. Clearly, that's what's happened to us. And I don't think we're anywhere near out of that water. However, that water is changing.
Right.
So...
Yeah, that's really funny. And it raises this kind of big question, right? So if we're looking at it, I just gave the examples in nature, right? Of the stream or of outer space or language, right? Language. We have this thing that, we're communicating, we're saying something. But what's being said changes, right? Because the meanings of the words across languages might not be the same.
Yes.
The meanings that I ascribe to a word might not be the same meaning that you ascribe to the same word, all these different things. Do you think that this inherent nature of knowledge, do you think that's built into the universe or it's just built into humans?
That's a really fascinating question because language built in suggests a builder. And for me, there's no, as yet, justificatory material that would show me that there was a design. So I don't need to accept a builder design, but I follow your analogy, you see? And that's what we were talking about before, the idea of analogy. If it is evolved in, or built in, organically developed, however it may be, then I don't think we don't have anything to go on yet except human capacities. We're studying other animals. We haven't discovered life anywhere else yet. And therefore, I think it's human-centric. Until we encounter a completely different life form and wrestle for centuries, if ever, to try to understand the language, because we're unlikely to have a Star Trek translator, which is, oh, so that's what you said. Okay. Wouldn't that be nice? Google on steroids. I don't see how we get past the human-centric, which is not to say we're the most important thing. I think Pete Singer and other ethics philosophers have pointed this out to us, that we aren't necessarily the most important thing on the planet. That's probably gotten us in a great deal of difficulty in itself. Yet, we struggle to understand ourselves. And we need to struggle to understand ourselves before we cast ourselves out and make even more generalizations about the entire universe. We need to study the universe. We need to study ourselves. And that we haven't learned enough nearly yet.
Yeah, that's so that's the thing is I'm looking, and this is sort of off track with skepticism, but I think in terms of philosophy, it's like one of the biggest questions you can ask, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are these things that we find so weird? Well, does space end, or does it go on forever, or does it bend back on itself? Is a stream really a stream, or is it never the same thing? Is all these different questions. So, do you think that the reason we perceive these problems as being problems is because of our own human perspective, right?
Yes, I think so.
So if that's the case, then you believe that the universe itself is knowable, perhaps not by humans, but it is possible to know to know things, to know everything, essentially.
Well, I don't.
We have an AI, right? This is our question from last week with authority.
Yes.
If you have the AI that can, see all wavelengths of light, hear all sounds, see all, it can pick up on every single possible measurement in the universe. Would we then be able to answer the question of, well, what is the universe? What is life? What is the meaning of things?
Arthur C. Clarke did a wonderful short story about this way back in the 60s. But I no, because the AI cannot suffuse the universe. If the universe is infinite, the AI cannot know all about the universe, and therefore it's not all knowable. There can be a pocket universe over here that has completely different rules. If you pop into that universe, you may not be able to come back out. One of these bubbly, quantum, effervescent universes that are talked about so frequently by physicists. All right. No, it's not completely knowable. Does that mean we shouldn't try to know? No, because we need to. I mean, the idea of the changing river, the skepticism is, well, I can't know everything about this river. No, probably not. But you can know if the chemical properties of that river are changing. And then you can ask, why are they changing? And if it points to some pollutant that's happening upstream somewhere, then that's an addressable bit of knowledge that could potentially be changed or applied, and then changes made, which will then change the river again.
Right. So if mystery and mystique are an essential component of the universe, then it's not merely our human subjectivity that makes things unknowable. That adds to it. But the universe itself is in some ways unknowable.
In some ways, currently.
Regardless of human thought. Okay. Like I said, that has nothing to do with skepticism. I was mostly just asking questions. Yeah. So, but I mean, it kind of leads us into my next question here, right? Which is, why are we hardwired to both believe and be skeptical?
All right, I'm going to venture this. If there's such a thing as human nature, and that's questioned as well. If we are hardwired, then there is a use potentially for both things. And so we look at the idea of belief and we look at the idea of skepticism. Well, what is the potential use of both of those things? So I toss that to you. What is the potential use of being skeptical?
Well, I think that, if you look at it from a utilitarian, from a human utility standpoint, right, it probably is beneficial. We talked about it, I can't remember how many weeks ago it was, but humans and Neanderthals, right? I watched the episode and, they showed the tools from over the span of like 10,000 years.
Right.
Now, human tools evolved and the Neanderthal tools stayed the same. Well, if you're not skeptical, you're probably going to continue to do the same things the same ways. And that is not evolutionarily advantageous, right? Because with limited resources and a world that's constantly changing, you have to adjust your approaches to things. And so skepticism, I think, is what drives change. If you don't have a questioning attitude, then you will just continue to always do things the same way, which will result in extinction.
So if you always do what you always did, you always get what you always got. That's one of those truisms that we hear.
But that's not even necessarily true, right? Because you could be successful with those things until you run out of the resource, right? Well, and that's what happened to the Neanderthals, right? Well, I use this stone spear to kill this woolly rhinoceros until the woolly rhinoceros is gone. And then that stone spear doesn't work on a faster animal as well. And if you don't develop a faster implement, then you can't hunt new food and you die.
Well done. Now, bring it down right to ground zero, because I'm thinking of addressing, you look at some of the comments that we get on our podcast, and somebody was just incensed or just, I wish I'll never get that hour back where I listen to two guys blowing smoke. All right. Well, yes, you will, because you can stop doing some other lays around watching Netflix for an hour, and then you got your hour back. Go outside and get some air. But that's doing something different than your normal procedure. Thinking is hard. And yes, philosophy is not blowing smoke. It is playful. So, but let's get, without having to release any secrets that you're not supposed to talk about where you work, do you apply skepticism where you work?
Yeah. And I'd say it comes in the form of continual improvement, right? All companies do this. You have a continual improvement system, and you have a goal. You want to have 20 continual improvement ideas in a year, say, right? So what that says is that operates from an attitude of skepticism. You're saying, we are not doing things in an optimal, efficient manner somewhere. So you need to look around at the way we're currently doing things and think, how could we do this better? And then question what you're doing and come up with another solution.
Well said. Now, is there any belief involved in that? Because I hear a belief involved in that.
So I guess you're believing that there is a more efficient or better way.
Exactly. Yes. So there you are, skepticism and belief. Now, we're not talking about religious belief, but we don't have to. This is just on the ground application of something. If you're going to apply something, it generally points to a belief that something can have a measurable or an emotional, affective result. And why? Because you believe that that's probably a better way. So they're both right there. They're packed in together.
And so how do you think we make those decisions? Is it based purely on result?
Well, let's going back to your example, now I'll hop to something else, because actually the continuous improvement model, the business model, is in all of the academic realms as well. Ask it again. Do you think it can have a result?
So when we're talking about our beliefs and how being skeptical plays into them, how do we make those decisions? Because what you see is people come to radically different decisions based off of what they believe and how they're skeptical.
Well, there you are. Is there a balance? How you make the decisions? Well, let's see. It's going to be based on economics, which is not always the best reason to make a decision. Certainly, economics is what has with inaccurate information sometimes, has what led us to argue that we just can't move too fast in dealing with global climate crisis, because after all, it's going to affect jobs. Well, everything has affected jobs since pre-industrial revolution to industrial revolution. We seem to believe that the Industrial Revolution was really fine. Well, so that's just one thing, economics. I don't believe it because I don't want to. there's because I just can't confront my own preconceptions enough to change, or I want to believe that this can be better, and therefore I'm going to apply it. I think that there's so many clusters of things that affect us as we apply our skepticism and try to use what Heidegger and Hegel in their various ways were saying, to take the preconceptions that lead us to something and to eradicate the preconceptions that take us into dead ends.
Yeah, I think that decisions about what we believe and how we apply skepticism is difficult because people don't use just one informing factor, right? If it was all results driven, we'd come to we'd apply skepticism much differently than we do if we make decisions based off of ideations, right? Or, what we would wish was true, or, all of these different sorts of things. So, do you think that any form of belief requires faith?
Yes, if we're using faith in the loosest possible sense of a somewhat structured hope that what we are being told is accurate.
And that question on face value sounds pretty straightforward, but that has big implications for philosophy because, you think of belief and faith, it sort of conjures religious imagery. But if you apply it to science, right? If I believe the earth is round, do I have to have faith that the earth is round?
No, because faith implies a certitude that is unquestioned. This is where there's a difference between, however mild it might be, between belief and formalized faith. Faith urges not questioning, accept the word because the word is right, accept that this is what it means. And even, depending on which branch of religions across the planet you're talking about, there are practitioners who say, no, we're finding out new things every day. From archaeological digs to texts that didn't exist to the fact that if we look back through the 5 different translations of this particular book, we realize that it's unclear what this was really saying, as opposed to the evangelical leader who may be saying, this is exactly what the Bible means, or this is exactly what the Quran means, or, as soon as you're at that exactitude moment that can't be questioned, then you're in faith territory, not skepticism.
So my next question would be then, don't we all have to reach that point at some point? Because we talked about early in the episode, right, that everything springs from some preconceptions, right?
Yes.
So if we all have to operate from some base beliefs, mm-hmm. do those beliefs require faith, right? And I think it's the easiest with metaphysics, right? Talking about the universe, right? Mm-hmm. So if we look at, the Big Bang model of cosmology, right? So 14 billion years ago, there was a Big Bang and everything spread from there. Does that belief require faith?
No. Because if it required faith, then there would be no more questioning. I mean, that's the simple answer. Now let me make it a little more complicated. People of faith question sacred text, question to try to find out more accurately what the information might mean. And that they're moving away from faith into a mild but important academic skepticism. Belief implies more of a transience. I believe this for now until it's proven not so. I believe it. Why? Because of this stack of evidentiary material, which I've been told about, because I can't do that all myself. I rely on some authority, and authority is important in knowledge. So I have a belief that seems to be accurate, at least for now. And I have a belief that it will probably change because we continue to find knowledge. People of faith say, well, this is what it is, because it is. And there's a staticness that can settle in with that. But people of faith who question the sources of their own faith, and that sometimes leads them to be even more faithful, there's a dynamic activity going on there that faith by itself does not invite.
So there's this relationship between faith and belief. I tell you, because I was reading an article this morning, right? And you and I talked about it last week when we were talking about authority. 100, 200, 300 years ago, it was easy for lay people to understand most processes, and going back to the Middle Ages when you had the polymaths and there was the last man to know everything, right? You could know everything, the entire body of human knowledge. And now we've reached a point where I was reading an article today where they're talking about how the universe shouldn't exist, right? Because these certain scientists, they ran this experiment with protons and antiprotons inside some sort of specially constructed electromagnetic cage in order to stop the antiparticles from disintegrating and doing all this stuff. And they found that, man, there's really, when the universe started, there should have been a perfect balance of matter and antimatter that completely annihilated itself, and there should be nothing. And so the article was very long and very scientifically focused, And I read the whole thing and I understood it, right? But I still got to the end and realized, okay, I understand the basic science behind this. But what actually went in? They spent 10 years just constructing this electromagnetic cage in which to put antiprotons in order to stop them from decaying.
Yeah.
The specific science that went into doing any single step in this is so far beyond my ability to even comprehend it.
Most of us, yeah.
So I can believe what they're saying because there's some logical steps. But am I still having faith in the scientific process?
Well, only again, I would say only if you say that there is no questioning necessary. And you just belied that by saying, I'm thinking about it. I know that there seems to be some logic here, but this stuff is beyond me. But I believe because of the authority of the people who are involved. But that doesn't mean I believe that there's nothing new to learn from this. Now the accelerator did its job. And no, we don't believe that. And now I'm going to be wacky just because it's fun. I have said since the emergence of a certain orangish fellow that upon his rise, we went through a rift in the universe, and we arrived in an alternate universe. Well, the very fact that some of his people could talk about alternate facts, which are not things that exist, that could, if I'd had a glass of wine and relaxing, could convince me that it's possible that we really did go through a rift in the universe. Well, that's not just a strange thought if you think about quantum physics and so on. Well, I don't know, maybe when they flipped that switch and everybody said, oh, but there was a large percentage of chance that we might have just ceased to exist. Well, maybe we didn't. Maybe we just found a different place. That's the speculative fiction. That's the science fiction. That's the fun. That's the smoke blowing out my ears to some extent, but not entirely. So, but I don't believe it's a conspiracy. I don't believe it's a design or anything like that.
Yeah, and you know what? And it's like you said earlier. It is playful, but it's just as important as it is playful. And I don't think that it is blowing smoke, right? Because part of philosophy is looking at every postulation and thinking, okay, well, is there some sort of logical merit to this?
Yes,
right?
Yes.
Alternate facts. It sounds ridiculous. But like we were talking about earlier, well, knowledge is constantly changing and things are constantly eroding and changing. So, well, I guess if something was in the realm of a fact at one point, then new knowledge came and it was gone. Does that make it an alternate fact?
No,
well, no,
it makes
it doesn't.
A previous fact.
Right, exactly. Well, could something that's not a fact now eventually come into the realm of being a fact.
Like light speed being broken?
Right, yeah. So yeah, obviously I'm not making any sort of political statement here.
No, that's not the point.
Right. But the point is, we're just looking at these, anything that comes up, that's, like you said, thinking, if you want it to be, is very hard work.
Yeah.
And it's very important work. And sometimes you will think about something and it will come across a way that you did not originally think was possible, you know? Mm-hmm. And so, and part of that is skepticism. Part of it's questioning, you know, and that intersection of, you know, how faith informs beliefs, how we justify beliefs, what we can consider knowledge, and then how we question that knowledge or are skeptical about that knowledge. Not only are all of those things just vastly important, but the language behind how we ascribe meaning to each individual one is also
yes, it is. That's
so
very important.
deep.
That's an important point.
And we've talked about knowledge in the past, and I'm sure that, you know, I feel like this conversation is sort of leading into a deeper discussion of some of these things that we've talked about in this one.
I do too.
So we'll probably get into those next week. But until next time, keep pondering.